I want you to picture something with me, if you can. Just close your eyes for a second. We are traveling back in time, and we are traveling east.
Okay, I'm with you.
Imagine we are in Baghdad. It's a hot, dusty afternoon. The air is thick with that kind of, that dry heat that just settles in your lungs.
I can almost feel it.
The date is November 11th, 1959.
A very specific date and a very specific atmosphere, I imagine.
Exactly. We're inside a study. It's quiet, but it's a tense quiet. You can feel it in the air. The curtains are drawn tight, not just to keep out the relentless sun, but to keep out prying eyes. And sitting there at this heavy wooden desk is a man named Abdul Jabbar Al-Waily. He has a stack of lined paper in front of him, the kind you might see in a school notebook, a very humble paper. And he is writing furiously.
It's such a vivid image. And we have to pause on the context here because Baghdad, 1959, isn't just a setting. While it's a threat level.
Right. Set the stage for us.
Yeah.
Why are the curtains drawn? What is happening outside that window?
What's happening is that Iraq is a political pressure cooker that is about to explode. I mean, the monarchy has just fallen the year before. There's revolution in the air. But much more specifically, the Iraqi Communist Party is ascending with, frankly, terrifying speed.
So this isn't some abstract political debate.
Oh, no, not at all. They are infiltrating the military, the schools, the unions. In the foreword to this very manuscript we're discussing, Al-Waili explicitly uses the phrase communist terror sweeping the streets.
Communist terror. Those are his words.
His words. And he wasn't exaggerating. People were being dragged out of their homes. There were mob trials happening in public squares. If you were perceived as an enemy of the people, you were in mortal danger. So for Al-Waili to be sitting there, writing what he is writing, it's not a hobby. It is a profound act of defiance.
So you would think, in that situation, that a man like this would be writing a political pamphlet.
Right.
Maybe a list of names to contact for a counter-coup or a diary of atrocities to smuggle out to the West. Something immediate, something practical. But he isn't. He's doing something almost bafflingly calm in the middle of this storm. He's writing a philosophical treatise.
And that's the part that just gives me chills every time I think about it.
He's underlining headings in red ink.
Yeah.
He's carefully numbering pages. He is setting out to dismantle one of the most powerful and, at that moment, most dangerous ideologies of the 20th century communism. Not with a gun, not with a scream, but with logic.
With biology.
With history.
And with, of all things, modern physics.
It's incredible.
It really is. And that's what makes this document, this handwritten manuscript, so extraordinary. It is an artifact of pure intellectual resistance. We aren't looking at a political rant. We're looking at a carefully structured work titled Critique of Communist Philosophy. Al-Waili is taking the time, while his world is effectively burning down outside his window, to systematically attack the three great pillars of Marxism: dialectical materialism, historical materialism, and Marxist economics. He's going after the foundation.
And that is our mission for this deep dive.
Yeah.
We're going to try and unpack the mind of Al-Waili. We have this dusty handwritten manuscript as our source. And I want to be crystal clear to everyone listening. We are not here to say who is right or who is wrong in the grand scheme of geopolitics. We are not taking sides in the Cold War.
No, absolutely not. That's not the point.
The point is to see how he argues. We want to understand the intellectual architecture of his resistance. How does one man in a room in Baghdad use the behavior of a single cell, the history of the Arab Empire, and the price of a pair of shoes to challenge a global superpower?
It is a fascinating journey, and for many listeners, this will be the first time they actually get a clear, understandable explanation of what something like dialectical materialism even is. We have to understand it just so we can appreciate how Al-Waili tries to break it.
Oh, absolutely. That term dialectical materialism, I mean, it's been thrown around in lecture halls for 100 years, and I still think most people, myself included sometimes, just sort of nod along without having a clue what it really means.
It sounds like academic word salad.
It really does.
But it's a very structured way of looking at the entire universe, and it's the bedrock of everything else in Marxism.
So let's start right there. Part one of Al-Waili's manuscript tackles this head-on, the universe question. He goes right for the throat of dialectical materialism.
Yeah.
So set the table for us. What on earth are we actually talking about?
Okay, so to understand Al-Waili's critique, we first have to go way back to the ancient Greeks.
Okay.
The word dialectic comes from the Greek concept of debate, of dialogue. You think of people like Socrates or Heraclitus. The core idea is that the universe is not static, It's not a fixed thing. It is in constant flux. Everything is changing, always.
Okay, that makes sense. Nothing stays the same. The river you step in is never the same river twice.
Precisely.
Right.
But, and this is the key, it changes in a specific, predictable way. You have a thesis, which is just an idea or a state of being. Let's call it A.
A thing.
A thing, but A isn't stable forever. It inevitably clashes with its antithesis, its opposite, or B. And from that clash, that conflict, you don't get destruction. You get a synthesis, something new, C, that contains elements of both.
So conflict isn't just an accident. It's the engine of the universe. It's how things progress.
Exactly. It's the motor of change. Now, let's fast forward a couple thousand years to the 19th century. Hegel, the great German philosopher, picks this idea up and runs with it. He says, yes, this is how change happens, but the primary force driving it all is the spirit, or the idea.
The what now?
The Geist in German. For Hegel, the thought comes first, the non-physical idea. The physical world, our world, is just a shadow, a reflection of this grand cosmic spirit working itself out.
Okay, so thoughts create stuff. The idea of a chair comes before the physical chair.
On a cosmic scale, yes. Then Karl Marx comes along. And Marx, who was a student of Hegel's ideas, famously says he's going to turn Hegel upside down. He takes the dialectic, but he says, no, matter comes first.
The physical world.
The physical world, atoms, dirt, food, machines, that, he says, is the only reality. Our thoughts, our culture, our religion, our spirit, those are just byproducts. They're reflections of the material world.
So dialectical materialism is the belief that the entire history of the universe is just matter crashing into other matter.
Following these specific dialectical laws of conflict.
And creating everything from stars and planets to, eventually, human consciousness.
You've got it. So to put it simply, Hegel says thoughts create stuff. Marx says stuff creates thoughts. There is no God, no spirit, just matter moving around according to a set of rules. It is a purely material universe.
And this is where al-Waili plants his flag. He looks at this fundamental claim that matter creates life and consciousness purely through chemical reactions and motion. And he says, hold on. Scientifically, that just doesn't hold up.
He essentially says, show me the proof. And he says the proof isn't there.
This brings us to his first major counterargument, which I found surprisingly grounded in hard science for a philosophy text from 1959. He goes right to biology and chemistry.
He does. And he invites the reader to perform a thought experiment. Consider the first cell, the protoplasm, the very, very beginning of life on Earth.
The primordial soup.
The primordial soup theory, exactly. Now, the strict Marxist materialist view is that if you have the right chemicals, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, carbon, and you mix them under the right conditions with the right energy over millions of years, the inherent motion of matter will inevitably produce life. It's just a chemical process.
It's not a miracle. It's just chemistry playing out over a long timeline.
Right. But al-Waili challenges this with a very practical, almost laboratory-style argument. He says, look, we know the recipe for a cell. We know it has water, proteins, fats, all these different components. And we also know basic chemistry. He says you can take 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen, mix them, add a spark, and you get water.
All right, H2O, every single time. It's predictable.
It's a law. You can repeat it in a lab in Baghdad or in Boston. It always works. But al-Waili asks, what if you take all the chemical components of a living cell, every single protein, every lipid, every molecule of water, and you put them all together in a beaker and stir? Do you get a living, breathing, thinking organism?
No. You get a gooey mess. You get a soup of dead chemicals.
You get a soup of dead chemicals, exactly. Al-Waili uses this incredible analogy of the yellow yolk. He asks us to look at an egg.
Okay.
You have a living egg fertilized with the potential to become a chick. It has growth, will, a future. And right next to it, you have a dead egg, or maybe one that's been scrambled. Now, if you take both of those to a laboratory and run a chemical analysis, what do you find?
Pretty much the same stuff. Carbon, nitrogen, protein, fat.
The material components are nearly identical. The matter is the same. But one has the potential for life, for will, for growth. The other is just inert matter. Something fundamental is missing from the second one.
It's the Frankenstein problem, isn't it? You can stitch all the parts together, you can run electricity through them, but where does that spark of life actually come from?
That's it. That's the question he's asking. Al-Waili is arguing that there is a missing ingredient that materialism simply cannot explain. He calls it the secret of life. He argues that matter alone cannot explain the will to live. You can explain the chemical structure of a bird's wing with matter, sure, but can you explain the urge to fly?
That distinction between the structure and the urge is really powerful. And it feels like it leads directly to his second point in this section, which is the argument from instinct.
Yes, this is where he directly attacks the Marxist idea of blind necessity.
Blind necessity. It sounds like a heavy metal band from the 80s.
It does, doesn't it? But in Marxist philosophy, it's a very serious concept. It
Mhm.
means that nature operates blindly, without a plan, without any foresight or purpose. Evolution is just matter bumping into other matter and randomly sticking to what works for survival. There's no designer, no goal,
Just stuff happening.
just stuff happening. But al-Waili challenges this with the concept of the preserving instinct.
Walk us through that. What's the argument?
He asks us to observe a very primitive organism, maybe a single-celled amoeba in a drop of water. It has no brain, it has no nervous system, it certainly has no capacity for logic or philosophy. It's just a tiny blob of protoplasm.
Okay.
And yet what happens when you observe it? When it encounters something harmful, like a chemical toxin, it recoils, it flees. When it senses a source of food, it moves towards it. It hunts. When the environment changes, it tries to adapt. It acts with purpose.
And acts like it wants to stay along.
Exactly. It has a goal. And al-Waili's question is devastatingly simple. If this organism is just a bundle of chemicals, just blind matter operating under blind necessity, how does it know how to preserve itself? Where does this built-in guidance system come from?
A rock doesn't try to avoid a hammer.
Precisely. A rock is pure matter. It doesn't care if you smash it. Water doesn't care if you boil it. But life, even the simplest life, cares. It resists destruction. And al-Waili argues that this inherent drive to survive, this specific purpose found in a brainless creature, implies a force or a principle that is outside simple matter. He calls it a spiritual explanation rather than a purely material one.
It's a really interesting point.
Yeah.
Because he's not invoking a specific deity. He's just pointing to a phenomena resistance to non-existence and saying, your theory can't explain this.
Your theory has a hole in it. Matter accepts its fate. Life resists its fate. And he says dialectical materialism cannot account for that fundamental resistance.
So he's hitting them hard on biology. But then, and this is where I think he really shows his intellectual range and the cleverness of his argument, he pivots to physics.
Yeah.
And he uses the cutting-edge science of his time to attack the outdated science of Marx's time.
This is a critical and I think brilliant pivot. You have to remember, Karl Marx was writing in the mid-1800s. The physics of that era was Newtonian.
Billiard ball physics.
Exactly. The universe was seen as a giant clockwork machine. Matter was solid. Atoms were thought to be these tiny, hard, indivisible balls that were eternal and indestructible. You could move them, you could combine them, but you couldn't destroy them. That was the absolute foundation of materialism, that matter is the ultimate unkillable reality. It's the concrete floor of the universe.
But by 1959, when al-Waili is writing, that floor had completely fallen out.
Completely. I mean, we had Einstein, we had quantum mechanics, we had the splitting of the atom, we had the atomic bomb, a terrifyingly real-world demonstration of this new physics. Al-Waili writes directly about atomic theory and the conversion of matter into energy. He points out that modern science has proven beyond any doubt that matter is not eternal, it's not the fundamental thing.
Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. It's the most famous equation in the world. And it basically says matter can be converted into pure energy.
And that is a philosophical bombshell for a 19th century materialist. Al-Waili notes that matter, this supposedly solid, eternal stuff, can literally dissolve into something intangible, into energy, into radiation, into pure force. He writes, and this is the key line, matter is not the master of the universe, it is a form of energy.
Wow. So he's saying, Marx, you built your entire philosophy on the idea that matter is God, essentially, that matter is the only thing that's real and eternal. And al-Waili, using Einstein, comes back and says, actually, your God is just a temporary state. It's just frozen energy. It can disappear in a flash.
Right. And if matter can disappear, if it can be transformed into something non-material like energy, then it cannot logically be the absolute primary foundation of all existence. He argues that the solid ground Marx was standing on had evaporated into a cloud of radiation. He's telling the Marxists of his day, your science is obsolete, it's 100 years out of date, and therefore your philosophy, which is built on that science, is also obsolete.
It's such a sharp and elegant argument. He's not quoting religious texts here or appealing to faith. He's quoting the latest physics. He's saying, I'm not the one ignoring reality. You are.
Exactly. And that, in a nutshell, concludes his attack on the nature of the universe. He argues that biology shows us a spark that chemistry can't explain, and physics shows us that matter isn't even real in the solid, eternal way Marx needed it to be.
So if the foundation of the building dialectical materialism is that cracked and unstable, what happens to the rest of the structure?
Well, the next floor up in the Marxist skyscraper is called historical materialism, and that's where al-Waili goes next.
Okay, part two, the engine of history. This feels like where the philosophy starts to get very political.
It does. Historical materialism is basically the application of Marx's universal theory to human society. The core idea, when you boil it down, is shockingly simple. The economy drives everything. Marx calls it the relationship between the base and the superstructure.
Okay, you have to break those two terms down for us.
Yeah, of course. The base is the economy. It's how a society produces the things it needs to survive. It's the factories, the farms, the tools, the technology. And crucially, it includes the economic relationships, like the relationship between the worker and the boss, the slave and the master.
So the material stuff, how we make a living.
Yes. The superstructure is everything else. And I mean everything else. Religion, art, politics, legal systems, philosophy, family structures, culture.
And the relationship between them is.
It's a one-way street. The base determines the superstructure. The economic reality of a society creates the culture and ideas it needs to sustain itself. Marx would argue that you don't have wars because of opposing ideologies. You have wars because of competing economic needs.
You don't have religion because of divine revelation.
You have religion because the economic system of the time required a way to pacify the oppressed workers with the promise of a reward in the afterlife. It's the opiate of the masses.
So in the Marxist view, all of human history is just a receipt. It's just a long, complicated ledger of economic transactions. Every poem, every prayer, every revolution is just a byproduct of how we grow our wheat or smelt our iron.
Crucially, yes. It's a radical attempt to strip the idea completely out of history and replace it with the means of production. Ideas don't make history. Economic systems make history.
Now, al-Waili is sitting in Baghdad as he reads this, a city with thousands of years of dense, complicated history. And he looks at this theory and basically says this is ridiculously, almost childishly simple.
He admits that economics is a factor. He's not naive. He knows people fight over resources, over trade routes, over wealth, but he absolutely refuses to accept that it is the only factor or even the primary one.
His counter-argument is that ideas move the world, not just hunger or greed.
And he starts building his case by first addressing another materialist theory of history, the role of geography. Now, for centuries, there were thinkers like Montesquieu and even the great Arab historian Ibn Khaldun who argued that geography and climate determine a people's character.
Right, the idea that people in hot climates are passionate and maybe lazy, and people in cold, harsh climates are industrious and stoic, environmental determinism.
Exactly. It's a form of material determinism. The physical world shapes the human. And al-Waili sees this as a cousin to Marxism. He critiques this idea first, and he uses the example of Greece.
What's the argument there?
He says, look at the physical geography of Greece. It's a rocky peninsula with a specific Mediterranean climate. That geography has not fundamentally changed in 5,000 years. The mountains are in the same place, the sea is the same, the sun hits it at the same angle every day, the soil is the same.
The stage is set, and the set doesn't change.
But the play performed on that stage changes wildly. At one point in history, this rocky peninsula was the intellectual and military superpower of the world. Aristotle, Plato, Alexander the Great, the birth of democracy. At other times, it was a quiet Roman province. At other times, a backwater. At other times, a subject of the Ottoman Empire. If the material conditions, the geography didn't change, why did the history, the culture, the power of the people living there change so drastically?
That is a great point. If the rocks make the man, then the man should stay the same as long as the rocks do.
But he doesn't. Al-Waili says the variable that changed wasn't the dirt, it was the mind. It was the ideas, the culture, the spirit of the people. And this, for him, proves that the human element, the superstructure, if you will, has an independent power that can't be reduced to its material setting.
And this leads him directly to what I think is the centerpiece of his entire historical argument. He uses a case study that is very personal for him, one that he knows intimately, the rise of Arab civilization and the spread of Islam.
This is where he really leans into his own heritage to directly counter the European-centric worldview of Marx. You see, a dedicated Marxist historian has to find an economic reason for the explosion of Islam out of Arabia in the 7th century. They have to.
They can't just accept the traditional narrative that God spoke to the prophet.
Absolutely not. So
Yeah.
they have to look for material causes. They'll say things like, oh, the Byzantine and Persian trade routes were in decline, creating an economic vacuum, or there was a crisis in the Meccan merchant class that required a new ideology. They need to find a dollar sign hiding behind the Prophet Muhammad.
But al-Waili says, just look at the map. Look at the facts on the ground.
Right. He describes the Arabian Peninsula before the arrival of Islam. What was it? It was historically isolated. It was a harsh, unforgiving desert. Economically, it was largely stagnant, made up of pastoral nomads and a few trading towns. There was no sudden discovery of gold or oil in the 7th century. There was no new agricultural technology that suddenly created a massive surplus. The material base was exactly the same as it had been for centuries.
So according to strict Marxist theory, if the base didn't change, the superstructure shouldn't have undergone some radical transformation.
Precisely. And yet, what happened? Almost overnight, in historical terms, these scattered, warring tribes united with a fervor the world had never seen. They erupted out of the peninsula and created one of the largest and most dynamic empires in human history. They conquered the Persian Empire, they swept through North Africa, they crossed into Spain.
So if it wasn't a change in the economy, what changed?
Al-Waili's answer is simple and direct. The idea, the call. It was a religious and spiritual revolution that drove the physical, material expansion, not the other way around. The economy didn't create the religion created the empire, which then fundamentally changed the economy of the entire region for 1,000 years.
He has this beautiful analogy that he uses, the analogy of grafting. I really love this image.
It's very poetic, but also very precise. He compares a civilization to a tree. He says the early Arab civilization was like a hardy wild tree growing in the desert, strong but simple. Then, as the civilization expanded, it came into contact with the ancient knowledge of Greece and Persia, and they grafted these branches of knowledge, philosophy, mathematics, medicine, administration onto their own tree.
So you're attaching a new fruit-bearing limb onto an old, strong trunk.
Yes, but, and this is the absolute key to the analogy, he says the sap that drove the growth, the life force that flowed through the trunk and made those new branches explode with fruit, was the new spiritual ideology of Islam. It wasn't a new farming technique or a new currency that energized the Arabs. It was a belief system. Without that new, powerful sap, the graft would have just withered and died.
So he's arguing that if you look at the history of his own people, the Marxist economic theory just completely falls apart. You cannot explain the fervor of the early caliphate with a balance sheet.
You can't. And he extends the same logic to the Crusades. This is another historical event where Marxist historians often say, look, the Crusades weren't really about religion. That was just propaganda. They were really about opening up trade routes to the east and plundering gold and land.
Which, to be fair, certainly did happen. People got rich. The Venetians basically built their maritime empire on the back of the Crusades.
They absolutely did. And al-Waili doesn't deny that economic motives came into play. But he argues that you cannot explain the origin and the incredible sustainment of that 200-year war with economics alone. He points to the sheer fervor. People from all classes of society left their homes, mortgaged their lands, and traveled thousands of miles to fight and die in a desert.
That's a lot of personal commitment for a potential shift in trade policy.
It is. Al-Waili says the primary driver, the thing that got the whole enterprise off the ground and kept it going for centuries, was religious belief. However you want to judge that belief, as misguided or noble. It was an idea war. He argues that if you try to reduce the First Crusade to just a trade dispute, you are fundamentally misunderstanding human motivation. You can't explain that level of mass sacrifice with a profit motive.
This all seems to connect to his defense of the individual in history, doesn't it?
Yeah.
What some people call the great man theory.
Yes, it's the final piece of his historical argument. You see, Marxism, because it's so focused on systems and economic classes, tends to view individuals as almost irrelevant. They are just products of their time, cogs in the machine. Napoleon wasn't a unique military genius. He was just the guy who happened to be standing there when the economic conditions of post-revolutionary France required a dictator to emerge.
If Napoleon hadn't been born, someone else, let's call him Pierre, would have stepped in and done the exact same thing.
That's the deterministic view. It's a rather depressing view of human agency. We're all just riding a historical wave that we have no control over. Al-Waili pushes back against this hard. He defends the role of the genius, the visionary, the prophet. He argues that certain specific individuals, a prophet Muhammad and Aristotle and Einstein, an inventor, force history to turn a corner.
History doesn't just make the man, sometimes the man remakes history.
Exactly. He argues that if you take that specific genius out of the equation, history doesn't just find a replacement. The entire track of history changes. He is putting the human mind and the power of the individual back in the driver's seat.
So we've covered the universe.
Mm-hmm.
He says it's not just matter, there's a spark. We've covered history. He says it's not just economics, it's driven by ideas. Now, we have to go to the third and final pillar, and this is the one that arguably impacts people's daily lives the most. Part 3, the wallet. Communist economics.
The bread and butter, literally.
Now, the absolute core of Marxist economics is something called the labor theory of value. And al-Waili spends a good amount of ink in this manuscript trying to methodically tear the theory apart.
He does. And to understand his critique, we have to first really understand the theory itself. Marx argued in a very systematic way that the true value of any product is determined objectively by one thing and one thing only: the amount of socially necessary labor time required to produce it.
Okay, can you explain that like I'm 5?
I'll try. Let's say I am a carpenter, and it takes me, on average, 4 hours to make a simple wooden chair. The value of that chair, according to Marx, is 4 hours of labor.
Simple enough.
Now, if a capitalist factory owner pays me for, say, 2 hours of my labor but sells the chair for a price equivalent to 4 hours of labor, Marx says he has stolen 2 hours of surplus value from me. All profit, in this view, is theft. The fundamental equation is value equals labor time.
It sounds very neat and tidy, very scientific. 4 hours of work equals 4 hours of value. But al-Waili looks at this and says this is completely ridiculous because, well, not all labor is the same. Not all humans are the same.
Exactly. He attacks the fundamental premise that labor is a uniform, generic substance that you can just measure with a stopwatch. He brings up the crucial distinction between quality and quantity. And to illustrate this, he uses the wonderful example of the artist versus the cobbler.
This is a great visual. I remember this part clearly.
He says, imagine a masterful painter, a true genius, a Rembrandt or a Da Vinci. He spends 2 months in his studio working on a canvas. He pours his soul, his lifetime of skill, his unique, unreplicable vision into this one painting.
Okay. 2 months of labor.
Now, in the workshop next door, imagine a very diligent cobbler, a shoemaker. He works just as hard, maybe even harder. He also works for 2 months, and in that time, he produces a large pile of sturdy, well-made shoes.
So, on the clock, their labor time is equal.
According to the strict labor theory of value, yes. That one painting and that entire pile of shoes represent the exact same amount of labor time. Therefore, they should have the same economic value.
Oh, but that's obviously not true. In the real world, the painting might be priceless. It might be worth more than every shoe ever made, and the shoes are just shoes.
Right. And al-Waili asks the simple question, why? Why is the painting worth so much more? It's not because of the time invested. It's because of the creativity, the scarcity, the genius, the demand from people who appreciate that genius. He argues that value is inherently subjective. It comes from human desire and appreciation for an object, not just the sweat it took to make it.
He's saying that by trying to make all labor equal, communism completely ignores the genius factor. It has no way to account for unique talent.
Yes. It ignores the special skill that makes 1 hour of a brain surgeon's time more valuable to a sick patient than 1 hour of a ditch digger's time. Al-Waili's point is that you cannot weigh talent on a scale or measure it with a clock.
He also goes on to defend a character that communists and socialists typically despise: the merchant, the middleman.
Yes. In classic Marxist theory, the merchant is a parasite. He's a non-producer. He doesn't make the shoe, he just buys it cheap from the worker and sells it expensive to the customer. He adds no value because he didn't physically hammer any nails or stitch any leather.
He's just skimming profit off the top of the real laborer's work.
That's the Marxist view. Al-Waili says this is profoundly and dangerously wrong. He argues that the merchant performs a critical and often very difficult type of labor, the labor of logistics and risk.
The risk part is so key to his argument.
It is. Al-Waili argues, the factory worker makes the shoe, he gets paid his wage for the day, he goes home, his risk is over. The merchant, however, buys that shoe. His risk is just beginning. Now he has to find a customer who wants that exact shoe. He has to transport it maybe across the country. He has to store it in a warehouse.
And if that warehouse burns down,
the merchant loses everything. The worker still has his wages from last week. If a new fashion comes along and nobody wants that style of shoe anymore, The merchant is stuck with 1,000 pairs of worthless shoes. Al-Waili says this effort, the mental labor of predicting demand, the logistical labor of connecting the product to the person who needs it, and bearing the financial risk of failure, is a vital and valuable form of labor. Without the merchant, the shoe just sits in a warehouse and has no real value because nobody is wearing it.
He's basically giving a lecture on supply chain management or market economics in 1959 Baghdad. It's quite prescient.
He really is. He's dismantling the core economic definitions of Marxism. But then he goes even deeper into the psychology of ownership itself. And this was the part of the manuscript that felt the most human and relatable. He argues that the concept of private property isn't some evil capitalist invention forced on the masses. He believes it's a natural, fundamental human instinct.
He uses the example of a child, which is so simple and effective.
A very simple example. A child and a toy. You don't have to sit a toddler down and teach them the complex legal theory of ownership. They know it instinctively. They clutch their favorite toy and say, mine. Al-Waili argues that this desire to own things, to have a domain that is yours and that you are responsible for, is fundamental to human nature. It's hardwired into us.
And because of this, he predicts, and remember this 1959, the Soviet Union is at the height of its power, he predicts that any system of collective ownership is doomed to fail because it fights against this basic nature.
He specifically talks about the shared farm. This was a huge part of Soviet and Chinese communist policy, the collectivization of agriculture. Al-Waili sets up a simple scenario. Imagine a village with 1,000 farmers. The state takes their individual plots of land and creates one massive collective farm. The state says, everyone work this land together, and at the end of the year, we will divide the harvest equally among all of you.
On paper, it sounds like a utopia. From each according to his ability to each according to his need, everyone shares. No one goes hungry.
Ideally, yes. But Al-Waili, with a deep understanding of human psychology, asks, what happens to individual motivation? If I work 12 hours a day, sweating in the sun, carefully tending the crops, breaking my back, and my neighbor works 2 hours a day and spends the rest of the time sleeping under a tree, and at the end of the harvest, we both get the exact same sack of potatoes, what am I going to do next season?
You're going to find a very nice shady tree to sleep under. Why would you work harder for no additional reward?
Exactly. The hard worker loses all motivation. The lazy worker gets a free ride. Productivity plummets. Al-Waili writes, and I'm paraphrasing a bit here, but the sentiment is exact. The official in a government office works differently than a man tending his own garden.
That is a brilliant, brilliant line. It sums up the whole problem.
It's the eye of the owner. When you own something, you care for it intensely. You fix the broken fence because it's your fence and you don't want your animals to get out. You pull the weeds from the garden because those are your tomatoes. When the farm belongs to everyone, it effectively belongs to no one. The fence breaks, and nobody fixes it because it's not their specific problem, and they won't personally benefit from the effort.
He's really pinpointing the core efficiency problem that plagued the Soviet agricultural system for 70 years. It's the tragedy of the commons on a national scale.
He is, and he argues that by stripping away the profit motive, which is just the ability to improve your own life and your family's life through your own extra effort, you kill the spirit of invention and innovation. Why would anyone stay up all night designing a better tractor if the state will just take the design and you get nothing for your genius? He sees the communist system as one that inevitably turns everyone into a salaried bureaucrat, which leads to widespread apathy and economic stagnation.
So let's just take stock for a moment. In this one manuscript, Al-Waili has systematically tried to tear down the universe of communism, arguing its energy and spirit, not just matter. He's torn down their theory of history, arguing its ideas and individuals, not just economics. And now he's torn down their theory of economics, arguing that value is subjective and that private property is essential to human nature. He's left the entire communist intellectual building in a pile of rubble.
A thorough and methodical demolition.
But the question then becomes, what does he want to build in its place? Does he just leave us there in the ruins? Is he just a cheerleader for a kind of savage capitalism? Is his final message basically, greed is good?
Surprisingly, no, not at all. And this is part 4, the final section of his work, the Al-Waili alternative. He is absolutely not an American-style laissez-faire capitalist. He doesn't want unchecked monopolies and robber barons exploiting the working class. He explicitly acknowledges that unbridled capitalism has its own evils: greed, inequality, the crushing of the poor.
So what does he want then? What's the solution?
He proposes what he calls moderate socialism. Now today, we might call that a mixed economy, or perhaps a social democracy in the European style.
Okay, so what does that look like in practice, according to him?
He believes the state absolutely has a role to play. It should exist to prevent monopolies, to enforce contracts, and to ensure justice. He thinks there should be a social safety net to protect the weak and the vulnerable. He's not an anarchist by any stretch, but, and this is the big, non-negotiable but, the state must, at all costs, preserve the principles of private property and individual liberty.
Those are the two sacred pillars for him.
They are. His ideal society is one that rewards the genius, that rewards the hard worker, that allows the risk-taking merchant to profit from his efforts, but that also uses the power of the state to protect the weak from exploitation. It's a balance. He wants to harmonize the material needs of the human body with what he calls the spiritual and moral values of the human being.
It's a middle path and avoids the extremes.
It is, and that fits perfectly with his general philosophy we've been tracing. He hates intellectual extremes. He rejects the extreme of saying everything is just matter. And he also rejects the extreme of saying everything is just spirit. He wants a synthesis that respects both halves of the human experience.
So as we wrap up this really incredible deep dive, let's try to synthesize this ourselves. We've gone from the first living cell of protoplasm through the deserts of Arabia in the 7th century to the price of a pair of shoes in a modern economy, and finally to a vision of a balanced society.
It has been quite a journey, from the cosmic to the personal.
If you had to distill al-Waily's entire manuscript, his entire argument, down into one core idea, what would it be?
I think it would be a rejection of reductionism.
Unpack that for us. What does that mean?
Reductionism is the temptation to explain complex things by reducing them down to one single, simple cause. It's a form of intellectual laziness, really, and al-Waili fights it on every single page.
Give me the examples.
He refuses to reduce life to just chemistry. He says, no, there's a spark, a will to live. It's more complex than that. He refuses to reduce history to just economics. He says, no, there are ideas, religions, and individual geniuses. It's more complex than that. He refuses to reduce human value to just labor hours clocked on a factory floor. He says, no, there is talent, creativity, and quality. It's far more complex than that.
So it's a plea for the human spirit, for the unquantifiable in an age of machines and rigid ideologies.
Exactly. He is fighting against a worldview that treats human beings as just another type of matter to be managed, calculated, and socially engineered. He is shouting from his desk in that quiet, tense room in Baghdad, we are not just atoms, we are not just cogs in a machine, we are creators.
And that brings us to our final provocative thought for everyone listening. Al-Waili wrote this in 1959. He was, in essence, predicting the economic stagnation and eventual collapse of communist systems decades before the Berlin Wall actually fell. He saw, from first principles, that if you create a system that ignores fundamental aspects of human nature, the desire to own, to create for oneself, to believe in something beyond the material, that system will eventually run out of gas.
And it raises a fascinating and maybe uncomfortable question for us today. The Cold War is over, the Soviet Union is gone, but
we have new, much more powerful machines now.
We do. We live in a world of big data, of algorithms, of genetic sequencing, of biological determinism. We have tech visionaries and neuroscientists telling us that our brains are just biological computers, that our free will is an illusion, that our choices are just predictable chemical reactions, and that our entire future can be mapped out and predicted by a powerful enough algorithm.
We're right back to the idea of the human as a machine.
We are. The terminology has changed from dialectical materialism to dataism, but the underlying philosophy is eerily similar. You are just a collection of predictable parts. And so the question al-Waili's manuscript leaves us with is this: are we making the same mistake Marx did? Are we, in our modern technological confidence, trying to explain away the human spark with just numbers and biology?
It's a haunting question. It makes you wonder what can't be measured.
Al-Waili's hidden manuscript is a powerful reminder that there might be something essential in that yellow yolk. Something in the human will, in our capacity for genius and for belief, that you can never, ever capture in a spreadsheet.
Something to think about the next time you look at a great piece of art, or buy a pair of shoes, or just wonder why you bother to get out of bed in the morning.
Indeed.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the hidden manuscript of Abdul Jabbar Al-Waily. We'll see you next time.